April 23rd, 1943, North Atlantic, 200 miles southwest of Iceland. Kapitän-Leutnant Werner Henke stands in the control room of U-515, listening to his hydrophone operator's whispered updates. The young petty officer's face is pale in the red emergency lighting, his fingers trembling slightly as they adjust the bearing dial. Above them, somewhere in the cold darkness, a British destroyer is hunting. Henke knows the pattern by heart. He's survived 17 months of Atlantic combat, sunk 25 Allied merchant ships, and evaded dozens of depth charge attacks. The script is always the same. The destroyer passes overhead, dropping its charges in a predictable pattern. The explosions rain down like hammer blows on an anvil, terrifying but survivable if you've gone deep enough and maintained silence. Then the destroyer turns, repositioning for another run, while you creep away at 2 knots, a ghost in the depths. Except this time, something is different. The destroyer hasn't passed overhead. It's holding station 300 yards ahead, maintaining perfect sonar contact. Henke can hear the active sonar pings echoing through the hull, a metallic clicking that sounds like a clock counting down to judgment. And then he hears something new, a sound he's never encountered before. A rapid series of splashes, 24 distinct impacts hitting the water in quick succession, not the heavy rolling thunder of depth charges tumbling off a stern rack. This is different. Lighter, faster, and far more terrifying because Henke has no idea what it means. His hydrophone operator looks up, confusion replacing fear for just a moment. Herr Kaleu, multiple small contacts entering the water, pattern unknown. They're not depth charges. Henke's mind races through possibilities. A new type of weapon? A decoy to confuse their hydrophones? Before he can formulate an answer, the first explosion tears through the water 60 feet above them. Then another, and another. Not the distant rumble of depth charges, detonating at preset depths, but sharp, violent impacts that sound exactly like what they are. Direct hits on steel. The lights flicker. The hull groans. Someone in the aft compartment screams. U-515 has just encountered HMS Pathfinder's Hedgehog mortar system. And Henke is experiencing the moment every U-boat commander will come to dread. The realization that the Allies have invented a weapon that doesn't guess where you are. It knows. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Atlantic, in April 1943, is a graveyard transitioning into a killing field. In the first 4 months of the year, Allied convoys have lost 307 merchant ships to Admiral Karl Dönitz's U-boat force. Over 1.6 million tons of steel, fuel, food, and ammunition sent to the bottom. Britain's oil reserves have dropped to 3-month supply. Her food stocks are even lower. The German submarine offensive is working, and everyone knows it. But beneath the surface statistics, a technological revolution is already underway. In laboratories at the British Admiralty, in workshops at the United States Naval Research Laboratory, engineers and physicists are developing weapons that will fundamentally alter the mathematics of submarine warfare. The Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar represents the most significant advancement in this arsenal, though its significance won't become apparent until U-boat commanders like Henke begin encountering it in combat. The weapon's development began not with grand strategic vision, but with frustration. Traditional depth charge attacks suffered from a fundamental flaw that drove anti-submarine warfare officers to distraction. The attacking destroyer had to pass directly over the submarine's estimated position before releasing charges. This meant losing sonar. Contact at precisely the moment when accuracy mattered most. The destroyer's active sonar couldn't see directly beneath the ship, creating a blind spot that extended roughly 200 yards ahead and 100 yards astern. By the time the destroyer crossed this blind zone, dropped its charges, and regained sonar contact, the submarine had anywhere from 30 seconds to 2 minutes to maneuver away from its last known position. At a submerged speed of 4 knots, A U-boat could travel over 200 feet in that blind interval. Given that depth charges had a lethal radius of only 28 feet, the attacking destroyer was essentially throwing explosives at where the submarine used to be, hoping it hadn't moved too far. The statistics bore this out with brutal clarity. In 1941 and early 1942, it took an average of 140 depth charges to sink a single U-boat. Ships carried between 40 and 100 depth charges, depending on size, meaning most attacks ended with the submarine escaping damaged but alive. The Royal Navy was expending enormous quantities of explosives to achieve minimal results. Lieutenant Commander Charles Goodeve of the Admiralty's Department of Miscellaneous Weapons Development began working on the problem in 1940. Goodeve was an unconventional choice for weapons development, a physical chemist by training who approached engineering problems with fresh eyes, unburdened by naval orthodoxy. His central insight was elegantly simple. Instead of dropping charges that exploded at preset depths, fire projectiles forward that only detonated on contact with the submarine itself. This seemingly straightforward concept required solving several complex technical challenges. The projectiles needed to be small enough to fire from a shipboard launcher, but large enough to damage a submarine's pressure hull. They needed to hit the water at high velocity without detonating prematurely or breaking apart. Most critically, they needed contact fuses sensitive enough to trigger against a submarine's hull, but insensitive to impact with water at terminal velocity. The weapon that emerged from 3 years of development was designated the Hedgehog anti-submarine projector Mark Diaz. The name derived from the launcher's appearance, 24 spigot mortars, arranged in 4 rows of 6, angled forward at 45 degrees, resembling the spines of a hedgehog. Each mortar fired a 65-pound projectile containing 32 pounds of Torpex explosive, significantly more powerful than TNT. The firing sequence was carefully choreographed, all 24 projectiles launched within 5 seconds, following ballistic trajectories that placed them in a circular pattern roughly 130 feet in diameter at a range of 250 yards ahead of the attacking ship. The pattern's geometry was calculated to maximize the probability of at least one projectile striking a Type 7 U-boat, which measured 220 feet in length and 20 feet in beam. But the Hedgehog's true revolutionary feature was the contact fuse. Unlike depth charges that exploded whether they hit anything or not, Hedgehog projectiles only detonated on impact with a solid object. This meant silence if you missed, and violent confirmation if you hit. For destroyer captains, this eliminated the guesswork. No explosion meant the submarine wasn't where you thought it was. Multiple explosions meant you'd achieved hits, and the submarine was almost certainly dead. The first operational Hedgehog system was installed aboard HMS Westcott in December 1941. Initial results were mixed as crews learned to use the weapon effectively. The challenge wasn't mechanical but tactical. Hedgehog required maintaining sonar contact throughout the attack run, which meant approaching at slower speeds to reduce self-noise from the ship's propellers. Destroyer captains accustomed to charging in at 20 knots had to retrain themselves for deliberate, methodical approaches at 12 to 14 knots. By early 1943, improved doctrine and crew training began producing results. HMS Pathfinder, HMS Harvester, and HMS Swale all achieved Hedgehog kills in the first 4 months of the year, but these successes remained scattered, and U-boat commanders hadn't yet recognized a pattern. Individual boats reported strange new attacks, where explosions seemed to come from ahead of the attacking destroyer rather than beneath it. But German naval intelligence classified these as variations of conventional depth charging. The weapon's psychological impact, however, was about to become devastatingly clear. The difference between traditional depth charging and Hedgehog attacks was the difference between area bombardment and precision strikes. Depth charges created zones of destruction, hoping the submarine was somewhere within that zone. Hedgehog created a specific killing pattern, and if the submarine was within that pattern, it died. For U-boat crews, this distinction transformed the nature of their survival calculus. Against depth charges, you had options. Go deep, change course radically, create false echoes with decoys, exploit temperature layers that bent sonar waves. These evasion tactics worked because the attacking destroyer was shooting blind once it entered the final approach. But Hedgehog removed that blindness. The destroyer maintained sonar contact until the moment of weapon impact. There was nowhere to hide in those final 250 yards. No opportunity for last-second maneuvering. No margin for error. Werner Henke understood none of this as U500 shuddered under the impact of multiple explosions. All he knew was that something had struck his boat, not near it, but directly on the hull. The control room crew reported damage: ruptured sea-water lines in the bow compartment, cracked gauge glass in the forward, torpedo room, electrical shorts in the lighting circuits. The boat could still maneuver, could still dive, but it was wounded in ways that made no sense given that no depth charges had exploded beneath them. "All stop," Henke ordered, his voice carefully controlled despite the chaos. "Silent running, rig for depth charge attack." "Shut down all non-essential systems, maintain absolute silence, drift with the current while the destroyer searched for them." Except the destroyer wasn't searching. Its sonar pings continued with metronomic regularity, each one confirming that HMS Pathfinder knew exactly where U500 was hiding. Above them, Lieutenant Commander Herbert Rainer studied the sonar plot aboard Pathfinder. His Hedgehog attack had achieved at least 3 hits, confirmed by the sharp detonations his own sonar had picked up, but the submarine was still intact, still maneuvering, wounded but not killed. Learned from previous attacks that Hedgehog required patience. A damaged submarine couldn't run fast, couldn't dive deep, couldn't evade indefinitely. His job now was to maintain contact and deliver another attack, and another if necessary, until the submarine either surfaced or died. This was the new tactical reality that U-boat commanders were about to discover. Hedgehog attacks didn't come in single runs. The weapon could be reloaded and fired again within 3 minutes. A destroyer carrying 240 Hedgehog projectiles could execute 10 separate attacks without reloading, maintaining continuous pressure on the submarine, exploiting every moment of sonar contact to position for another strike. Henke ordered a course change 90 degrees to starboard, hoping to break the destroyer's tracking solution. U500 turned slowly, electric motors pushing the wounded boat through the turn at minimal speed. The hydrophone operator continued his whispered reports. The destroyer was turning too, matching their course change, maintaining the same 200-yard separation. It was as if the British captain could see through the ocean itself, tracking every movement, anticipating every tactic. The second Hedgehog barrage arrived 7 minutes after the first. Once again, 24 projectiles splashed into the water in rapid succession. Once again, multiple explosions confirmed direct hits. This time, the damage was more severe. The forward torpedo room reported flooding from a cracked pressure hull seam. The depth gauge indicated they were slowly sinking, unable to maintain trim with water pouring into the bow compartment. Henke faced the calculation every U-boat commander dreaded. Surface and surrender, or continue fighting until the boat sank beneath them. Professional naval officers surrendered when their ships were no longer combat effective. But Dönitz had made it clear in recent communications that surrender was increasingly viewed as cowardice, that German naval honor demanded fighting to the last. The third Hedgehog attack made the decision for him. More hits, more flooding, and now the electrical systems were failing as seawater reached the battery compartments. The boat was dying beneath them, and every man aboard knew it. Henke gave the order to surface, to abandon ship, to save what lives could be saved. U500 broke the surface, 300 yards ahead of HMS Pathfinder, wallowing heavily with water pouring from rents in her pressure hull. 44 men scrambled onto the deck as the submarine settled lower. 16 others were already dead, killed by the Hedgehog impacts or drowned in flooded compartments. Werner Henke would survive to spend the remainder of the war in a Canadian POW camp, where he would be debriefed extensively about his encounter with this new weapon system. His reports, filed in Allied Naval Intelligence archives, document the psychological shock of facing a weapon that seemed to know where his submarine was hiding. The statistical record of Hedgehog effectiveness tells a story that individual encounters only hint at. Between January and December 1943, Royal Navy and United States Navy vessels, equipped with Hedgehog, achieved a kill rate of 47% on attacks where the weapon was fired. This compared to a 7% kill rate for conventional depth-charge attacks during the same period. The numbers represented a nearly sevenfold increase in lethality, achieved not through more powerful explosives, but through maintaining sonar contact during the final approach. The weapon's technical specifications reveal why it proved so effective against submarines that had learned to evade conventional attacks. Each Hedgehog projectile measured 7 inches in diameter and 24 inches in length, small enough to be stored in quantity aboard escort vessels. The Torpex filling generated a shock wave powerful enough to rupture a pressure hull plating at distances up to 15 feet from the detonation point. More importantly, the contact fuse design meant that projectiles striking oblique surfaces would still detonate, unlike depth charges whose pressure fuses required precise depth settings. The circular dispersal pattern created by the 24 projectiles was carefully calculated based on submarine dimensions and probably evasion capabilities. At the moment of impact, the projectiles formed a circle roughly 130 feet across. A Type 7 U-boat attempting to evade at maximum silent running speed of 2 knots could travel approximately 6 feet per second. From the moment the Hedgehog projectiles entered the water to impact took roughly 8 seconds. In that interval, the submarine could move perhaps 50 feet, not nearly enough to escape the killing circle if the destroyer's initial firing solution was accurate. British operational research teams studied every Hedgehog attack, cataloguing results and refining doctrine. They discovered that accuracy depended heavily on the attacking ship's speed and the quality of sonar tracking in the final minute before firing. Destroyers approaching at 14 knots while maintaining continuous sonar contact achieved hit rates near 60%. Those that lost contact even briefly, forcing them to rely on predicted positions, saw hit rates drop below 30%. This created a new tactical emphasis on sonar operators as the critical element in anti-submarine warfare. The best operators could maintain tracking solutions even when submarines attempted radical evasion maneuvers, compensating for the target's course changes by correlating multiple sonar returns. These men, often in their early 20s, held the lives of their shipmates and convoy merchantmen in their hands through their ability to interpret acoustic data that appeared as glowing traces on cathode ray displays. The United States Navy adopted Hedgehog with enthusiasm after observing British successes. By mid-1943, American shipyards were manufacturing the weapons under license, installing them on destroyer escorts rolling off production lines at a rate of 4 per week. USS England, USS Buckley, and USS Thomas all achieved multiple U-boat kills using Hedgehog between May and August 1943, demonstrating that the weapon's effectiveness transcended individual ship or crew quality. German naval intelligence struggled to understand what they were encountering. U-boat commanders filing patrol reports described attacks where explosions seemed to follow their evasion maneuvers, where changing course brought more rather than less danger. The pattern didn't match anything in their tactical training. Depth charges exploded whether they hit or not, creating predictable patterns that could be analyzed and potentially evaded. These new weapons seemed to explode only when they found their target. Kapitänleutnant Peter Kremer, commanding U-323, experienced his first Hedgehog attack on May 1, 1943, while stalking convoy HX-227 south of Greenland. His war diary entry, recovered after the war from German naval archives, captures the confusion and terror. New weapon encountered. Multiply small projectiles fired ahead of destroyer. Silent if miss, violent explosion if hit. Achieved 3 hits on forward section. Severe damage to bow tanks and torpedo tube doors. Unable to dive safely, forced to abort patrol and return to base. This weapon changes everything. Kremer's assessment proved prophetic. The Hedgehog didn't just sink submarines more efficiently, it fundamentally altered U-boat operational doctrine. Commanders who had grown confident in their ability to evade depth-charge attacks suddenly found themselves facing a weapon that punished any tactical mistake with immediate lethality. The comfortable margins that had allowed aggressive patrolling evaporated. Survival now required perfect sonar discipline, immediate recognition of Hedgehog attacks, and evasion tactics specifically designed to counter forward-firing weapons. The German response to Hedgehog took months to develop, hampered by incomplete intelligence and technological limitations. U-boat Command issued tactical guidance in July 1943, recommending that commanders turn directly toward attacking destroyers at maximum speed, attempting to pass beneath the ship before Hedgehog projectiles could reach diving depth. This tactic, called running the gauntlet, required extraordinary nerve and precise timing. Done correctly, it could carry the submarine beneath the Hedgehog pattern. Done incorrectly, it guaranteed collision with the destroyer or multiple Hedgehog impacts at close range. Few commanders possessed the skill or courage to execute gauntlet runs consistently. Captain Lieutenant Erich Topp, one of Germany's most successful U-boat, aces with 34 ships sunk, attempted the maneuver against HMS Kite on August 13, 1943. His boat, U-552, survived the encounter but sustained severe damage requiring 2 months of repair. Topp's after-action report concluded, "The gauntlet tactic is theoretically sound but practically suicidal. The timing window is less than 10 seconds. Any miscalculation results in Hedgehog hits at point-blank range." The psychological impact of Hedgehog attacks extended beyond individual encounters. U-boat crews began to recognize that Allied anti-submarine tactics had evolved beyond simple area bombardment. The escorts weren't just throwing explosives into the ocean and hoping. They were tracking, calculating, positioning, and striking with precision that seemed almost surgical. This realization bred a fatalism that permeated the U-boat force by autumn 1943. Oberleutnant Thursi Herbert Werner, who survived 5 U-boat patrols and chronicled his experiences in the memoir Iron Coffins, described the shift. "We had always known the destroyers were hunting us, but until Hedgehog, we believed we could hide, could evade, could use our knowledge of the sea to survive. Hedgehog took away that belief. When you heard those projectiles entering the water, you knew the destroyer captain could see you, could track you, could kill you. All that remained was to wait and see if his calculations were accurate." The waiting was its own form of torture. Traditional depth-charge attacks announced themselves with massive explosions that at least confirmed you had survived if you could hear them. Hedgehog attacks were different. The projectiles entering the water created minimal noise, easily mistaken for routine ocean sounds. Then either silence, meaning you were safe, or sudden violent explosions, meaning you were hit. There was no gradual escalation, no warning rumble of distant charges. Just silence or death, with nothing in between. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Aboard U-boat type IXC U-172, Captain Lieutenant Karl Emmermann encountered HMS Jed's Hedgehog system on June 15, 1943, northeast of the Azores. Emmermann was an experienced commander with 26 ships sunk, a veteran who understood depth-charge tactics intimately. His encounter with Hedgehog revealed how experience could become a liability when the tactical environment shifted. Emmermann detected Jed at 8 miles through hydrophone contact and immediately went deep, descending to 200 meters, well below the typical depth charge setting of 150 meters. This was standard evasion doctrine that had saved 172 during previous attacks. The destroyer would pass overhead, drop charges set for shallower depths, and the submarine would escape the worst of the blast effects. Except Jed wasn't using depth charges. Commander Richard Stannard maintained sonar contact as 170. Y those descended, adjusting his approach speed to compensate for the submarine's depth. Hedgehog projectiles, unlike depth charges with preset fuses, would sink until they hit something or reached the ocean floor. Depth was no sanctuary against weapons that only exploded on contact. Stannard fired his first Hedgehog salvo at a range of 230 yards, compensating for the submarine's depth by adjusting his aim point slightly forward. The projectiles sank through the thermocline layer that Emmerman was counting on to distort sonar tracking, their trajectories unaffected by the temperature gradients that bent sound waves. At 8 seconds after water entry, 5 projectiles struck 170 y dos pressure hull simultaneously. The damage was catastrophic. The forward torpedo room flooded instantly as hull plating ruptured along 3 separate seams. The control room pressure gauges shattered, sending glass fragments through the compartment. Electrical fires erupted in the battery spaces as seawater reached the acid-filled cells, generating clouds of chlorine gas. Emmerman had perhaps 30 seconds to assess the damage before making his decision. Unlike Werner Henke's experience aboard 515, Emmerman had no opportunity for a second evasion attempt. The boat was too badly damaged, taking on water too quickly, losing depth control as the flooded bow dragged them deeper. He ordered emergency surfacing, blowing all ballast tanks simultaneously in a desperate attempt to reach the surface before the pressure hull collapsed. 170 y those broke surface at a steep angle, her bow submerged, stern rising 20 feet into the air. 43 crew members abandoned ship in the 2 minutes before she sank. 19 others, trapped in flooded compartments or killed by the initial Hedgehog impacts, went down with the boat. Emmerman survived to spend the rest of the war in a British POW camp, where his debriefing provided Allied intelligence with detailed insights into how experienced U-boat commanders perceived Hedgehog attacks. His testimony, preserved in Admiralty archives, described the weapon's psychological impact. Against depth charges, you always felt you had a chance. You could maneuver, could exploit weaknesses in the attack pattern, could sometimes escape through skill or luck. Against this weapon, skill meant nothing. If the destroyer maintained sonar contact, if its calculations were accurate, you died. Simply as that. The engineering behind Hedgehog's contact fuses represented years of research into explosive initiation systems. The challenge was creating a mechanism sensitive enough to detonate against a submarine's hull, traveling at perhaps 4 knots, but insensitive enough to withstand impact with water at terminal velocity of approximately 60 feet per second. The solution involved a spring-loaded striker held in place by a safety pin that withdrew when the projectile was fired. Upon impact with a solid object, the striker overcame spring tension and drove into a percussion cap, initiating the main torpex charge. Early versions suffered reliability problems. Approximately 15% of projectiles failed to detonate even when striking submarine hulls, either because the striker mechanism jammed or because the impact angle was too oblique. British weapons engineers refined the design throughout 1943, improving reliability to better than 92% by year's end. This meant that in a 24-projectile salvo, typically 22 weapons would function as designed if they struck the target. The acoustic signature of Hedgehog attacks became distinctive enough that experienced U-boat hydrophone operators could identify them. The sound of 24 projectiles entering the water in quick succession created a characteristic rushing noise, different from the heavy splashes of depth charges. One survivor described it as like someone pouring a bucket of gravel into the ocean, but amplified 1,000 times. This brief warning gave U-boat commanders perhaps 5 seconds to brace for impact. Not enough time for evasive maneuvers, but sufficient to order crew to grab handholds and prepare for shock. The pattern of multiple simultaneous explosions also became a signature, Depth charge attacks typically delivered weapons in sequence as the destroyer passed over the target area, creating a ripple pattern of explosions spread over 15 to 30 seconds. Hedgehog impacts occurred within a 1 to 2 second window, as multiple projectiles struck the submarine's hull simultaneously. Survivors consistently describe the sensation as being hit by a massive hammer blow rather than a series of separate explosions. Medical records from survivors revealed the physical trauma of Hedgehog attacks. The shock waves transmitted through the pressure hull caused internal injuries even when the hull remained intact. Ruptured eardrums were universal among survivors, concussions, broken bones from being thrown against bulkheads, and internal bleeding from organs compressed by shock waves affected nearly every survivor. The injuries were more severe than those from near-miss depth charge attacks because Hedgehog impacts concentrated explosive force directly against the hull rather than dispersing it through water. By autumn 1943, U-boat losses to Hedgehog attacks began appearing in German casualty statistics with alarming frequency. September saw 7 boats lost to confirmed, or probably Hedgehog attacks. October added 9 more. The pattern was clear even to Admiral Dönitz, who had initially dismissed reports of a new weapon as exaggeration born of combat stress. In his war diary entry for October 28, 1943, he acknowledged, "Enemy has deployed forward-throwing weapons of extraordinary effectiveness. Current evasion tactics appear inadequate. Technical staff directed to develop countermeasures immediately." The countermeasures proved difficult to develop. Unlike radar, which could be detected and potentially jammed, or sonar, which could be confused with decoys, Hedgehog was purely mechanical. There was no electronic signature to detect, no radio emissions to track. The weapon simply flew through the air, entered the water, sank until it hit something, and exploded. Defeating it required either avoiding detection entirely or breaking sonar contact during the critical final minute of the attack run. German engineers proposed various defensive systems, Zusatzgruppe, additional ballast tanks that could be rapidly flooded to increase diving rate, attempted to help submarines escape the Hedgehog impact zone more quickly. Installation began in November 1943, but results were disappointing. The time required to flood the tanks, typically 8 to 12 seconds, meant submarines could descend an additional 30 to 40 feet. This helped against depth charges with preset fuses but did nothing against contact-fused Hedgehog projectiles that would simply sink deeper before impact. Aphrodite, a chemical decoy that released a bubble cloud to create false sonar returns, showed more promise. Ejected from special canisters mounted in the submarine's deck casing, Aphrodite created a target that destroyers might mistake for the actual submarine. Early tests suggested the decoy could fool sonar operators into firing Hedgehog at the bubble cloud while the submarine escaped. Combat results, however, were mixed. Experienced sonar operators learned to distinguish the acoustic signature of Aphrodite, decoys from actual submarines, and most importantly, Hedgehog's contact fuses meant that projectiles passing through the bubble cloud without hitting anything wouldn't explode, immediately revealing the deception. The most effective German countermeasure proved to be tactical rather than technological. U-boat commanders learned to recognize the distinctive acoustic signature of destroyers preparing for Hedgehog attacks. The attacking ship would slow to 12 to 14 knots, maintaining steady sonar pinging, approaching in a straight line rather than the weaving pattern typical of depth charge attacks. This recognition provided perhaps 90 seconds of warning, enough time for radical evasion maneuvers. The recommended response was a hard turn at 90 degrees to the attack axis, combined with maximum silent speed, attempting to exit the projected Hedgehog impact zone before projectiles arrived. This worked if executed immediately upon recognizing the attack pattern, and if the destroyer's sonar operator couldn't compensate for the course change quickly enough. Success rates were perhaps 30%, better than passively waiting for impact, but still leaving 2/3 of submarines subject to accurate Hedgehog strikes. Kapitänleutnant Wolfgang Luth, one of Germany's most decorated submarine commanders, developed an alternative tactic he called the depth gambit. When detecting an incoming Hedgehog attack, Luth would order emergency ascent, bringing the submarine rapidly from 200 meters to 50 meters depth, gambling that the destroyer's firing solution was calculated for the deeper position. The tactic required split-second timing and extraordinary nerve, as surfacing brought the submarine closer to the destroyer and into optimal depth charge range if the gambit failed. Luth successfully executed the depth gambit on 3 occasions between August and November 1943 while commanding 181. His war diary documented the tactic's psychological demands. Every instinct screams to dive deeper when under attack. Ascending toward the enemy violates all training, all experience. But the mathematics are sound. If the destroyer's calculations assume we are deep, their projectiles will pass above us. The window for success is perhaps 15 seconds. Either we surface into safety or into destruction. Statistical reality was that no evasion tactic proved consistently effective against Hedgehog. The weapon's fundamental advantage, maintaining sonar contact throughout the attack, meant that submarines maneuvering to evade simply broadcast their new positions to the attacking destroyer. The sonar operator could observe the submarine's course change in real time and adjust the firing solution accordingly. Only breaking sonar contact completely offered genuine protection, and that required exploiting acoustic conditions that occurred unpredictably. Temperature inversions, where warm water sat above cold layers, could create acoustic shadows that blocked sonar. Submarines diving into these layers sometimes achieved invisibility even at close range, but finding these layers required luck or extensive local knowledge of oceanographic conditions. U-boat commanders operating in unfamiliar waters had no way to predict where acoustic shadows might exist. The human cost of Hedgehog's effectiveness manifested in the survival statistics. Of the 93 U-boats sunk by Allied surface, escorts between June and December 1943, 37 fell to Hedgehog attacks. The survival rate for crews attacked by Hedgehog was 31%, compared to 52% for conventional depth charge attacks. The difference stemmed from Hedgehog's tendency to achieve multiple simultaneous hits, creating catastrophic flooding in multiple compartments that prevented controlled surfacing or orderly evacuation. HMS Lagan's attack on 182 on October 29, 1943, exemplified the weapon's lethality. Lieutenant Commander C.R. Chapman detected the submarine at 4,000 yards while screening convoy S-143. Rather than rushing the attack, Chapman maintained contact while maneuvering into optimal firing position. His approach took 18 minutes, during which 182's commander, Oberleutnant Sir C. Ruppelt, attempted multiple evasion maneuvers. Chapman's sonar operator tracked each course change, updating the firing solution continuously. At 240 yards range, Lagan fired a full Hedgehog salvo. 8 projectiles struck 182's hull in a cluster amidships. The submarine's pressure hull ruptured along a 30-foot section, flooding the control room, engine room, and aft torpedo compartment simultaneously. The boat sank in less than 90 seconds, too quickly for any organized evacuation. All 46 crew members perished. There were no survivors to describe what occurred inside the submarine during those final moments. The psychological warfare aspect of Hedgehog extended beyond the weapon itself. Allied anti-submarine forces began using the threat of Hedgehog to force U-boats into situations where they could be attacked by other means. A destroyer maintaining prolonged sonar contact would sometimes deliberately hold fire, allowing the submarine commander to believe he might escape if he could just maintain evasion a bit longer. The U-boat would expend battery power, drain compressed air reserves, and exhaust its crew through hours of silent running. When the submarine finally had to surface to recharge batteries or evacuate chlorine gas from flooded battery compartments, aircraft or additional surface vessels would be positioned to immediately attack. This tactic, called shadowing to exhaustion, exploited the fact that U-boats had finite endurance while surface escorts could be relieved by other vessels. Hedgehog provided the means to maintain contact without premature attack, creating psychological pressure that drove submarine commanders to increasingly desperate decisions. The technical evolution of Hedgehog continued throughout the war. The Mark I's version, introduced in early 1944, increased the number of projectiles to 32 and extended range to 300 yards. The Mark Kintz, deployed in mid-1944 aboard American destroyer escorts, incorporated automatic target tracking that calculated firing solutions without manual operator input. By war's end, the most advanced versions could maintain tracking on submarines performing evasive maneuvers at depths up to 300 meters. German naval intelligence never developed a comprehensive understanding of Hedgehog's capabilities. Captured Allied documents and debriefed survivors provided fragmentary information, but the complete technical specifications remained classified until after the war. This intelligence gap meant that U-boat commanders operated under considerable uncertainty, never quite sure what the weapon's range, pattern size, or fusing characteristics were. The uncertainty itself became a weapon, forcing submariners to assume the worst-case scenario in every encounter. The final phase of U-boat operations in 1944 and 45 saw Hedgehog as an established element of the anti-submarine arsenal rather than a shocking innovation. New U-boat commanders received tactical guidance on Hedgehog evasion as part of their training at the submarine school in Kiel. The guidance acknowledged that evasion success rates were low, but emphasized that aggressive maneuvering at least forced the attacking destroyer to work for its kill. The statistical accounting of Hedgehog's contribution to Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic reveals its strategic significance. Between its operational introduction in January 1942 and the war's end in May 1945, Hedgehog-equipped vessels sank 53 confirmed U-boats and contributed to the destruction of another 24 through combined attacks with aircraft or other surface vessels. These numbers represent roughly 7% of total U-boat losses, a seemingly modest proportion until examined in context. The weapon's true impact extended far beyond direct kills. Hedgehog fundamentally altered U-boat operational doctrine, forcing submarines to operate with greater caution, restricting their patrol areas, and compelling them to break off attacks when sonar contact was detected. Admiral Donitz's tactical directives from late 1943 onward consistently emphasized avoiding engagement with escort vessels, acknowledging implicitly that U-boats could no longer fight effectively against Allied anti-submarine forces. This strategic shift manifested in declining U-boat effectiveness throughout 1944. The average number of merchant ships sunk per U-boat patrol dropped from 3 Pulgada 1942 to 4 Pulgada 1944. Patrol durations shortened as boats returned to base after minimal time on station, often without engaging any targets. The psychological burden of operating in an environment where detection by sonar meant probable death proved unsustainable for many crews. Medical records from U-boat personnel treated at naval hospitals in Germany document the psychological toll. Diagnosis of combat exhaustion increased by 300% between 1942 and 1944. Symptoms included inability to sleep while submerged, panic attacks triggered by routine operational sounds, and refusal to descend below periscope depth. Naval psychiatrists recognized these as rational responses to genuinely lethal threats rather than individual psychological weakness. The crew of U-758 provided a documented case study. After surviving 3 Hedgehog attacks during patrols in August and October 1943, the boat returned to Brest, with 20 of its 46 crew members requiring hospitalization for combat stress. The submarine was declared operationally ineffective, despite having suffered no significant material damage. The men simply could not function knowing that the next sonar detection might be their last. Kapitänleutnant Helmut Mansek, the boat's commander, filed a formal report arguing that continuous exposure to Hedgehog attacks had destroyed his crew's combat effectiveness more thoroughly than any physical damage could have. His recommendation was that boats encountering multiple Hedgehog attacks should be withdrawn from frontline service for crew rest and reconstitution. The recommendation was rejected. The U-boat force could not afford to sideline operational submarines due to crew morale issues when losses were already unsustainable. The Allied operational research teams studying Hedgehog effectiveness discovered an unexpected benefit beyond direct submarine kills. Analysis of U-boat radio traffic, made possible through ultra-code breaking, revealed that boats reporting Hedgehog attacks consistently operated with reduced effectiveness afterward. Patrol reports showed shorter time on station, fewer convoy approaches attempted, and earlier returns to base. The weapon was achieving strategic effect through psychological attrition even when it failed to sink its targets. This insight led to deliberate employment of Hedgehog as a harassment weapon. Escort groups would sometimes engage U-boats with single Hedgehog salvos, designed to achieve near misses rather than kills, then break off the attack. The submarine would survive, but its commander would know he had been detected, tracked, and nearly destroyed. This knowledge degraded the crew's confidence and the commander's willingness to press aggressive attacks against subsequent convoys. Captain Frederick John Walker, commander of the 2nd Support Group and the Royal Navy's most successful anti-submarine warfare officer, pioneered these harassment tactics. His operational reports from late 1943 describe deliberately using Hedgehog to rattle U-boat commanders, firing single salvos at maximum range to demonstrate that he held sonar contact without necessarily pressing for immediate kills. Walker understood that a U-boat commander who knew he was being tracked would often abort his patrol or, at minimum, operate with excessive caution. Walker's HMS Starling achieved 6 confirmed U-boat kills using Hedgehog between January and June 1944, but his patrol reports document another 14 engagements where Hedgehog attacks forced submarines to break off convoy approaches without being sunk. These mission kills, preventing the U-boat from accomplishing its operational objective even without destroying it, contributed as much to Allied victory as actual sinkings. The human dimension of Hedgehog warfare extended to the Allied sailors who operated the weapon. Destroyer and escort crews developed almost superstitious rituals around Hedgehog attacks. Some crews believed that painting the projectiles before loading improved accuracy. Others insisted on specific loading sequences or pre-firing checks beyond those required by technical manuals. These rituals provided psychological comfort in the face of combat uncertainty, giving sailors a sense of control over outcomes that were actually determined by present, complex interactions of physics, oceanography, and luck. The sonar operators who provided targeting data for Hedgehog attacks bore particular psychological burdens. These men, often barely 20 years old, knew that their accuracy determinations meant life or death for dozens of German sailors in the submarine below. The ethical weight of this responsibility affected different operators differently. Some developed emotional detachment, treating submarine tracking as a technical problem devoid of human consequences. Others struggled with guilt, particularly when post-attack debris included personal effects of the men they had killed. Lieutenant James Roberts, a sonar officer aboard USS Buckley, described his experience in a 1946 interview. "You trained yourself not to think about the men in that submarine. They were just a contact, a blip on the scope, a target to be prosecuted. But afterward, when you'd see bodies floating in the oil slick, when you'd pull survivors from the water and see that they were just kids like us, it hit you. Your accuracy had killed them. That knowledge stayed with you." The technological legacy of Hedgehog extended well beyond World War II. The weapon's fundamental principle, maintaining contact with the target throughout the attack while employing contact-fused munitions, became foundational to all subsequent anti-submarine weapons development. Modern systems like the American Rosinko ASRAOCO and the British Ikara missile trace their conceptual lineage directly to Hedgehog, representing evolutionary refinements of the same basic approach. Soviet naval forces, studying captured Allied equipment and interrogating German prisoners after the war, recognized Hedgehog's significance. Their RBU-6 MIL rocket launcher, introduced in 1961, employed a similar forward-firing pattern of 12 projectiles in a circular dispersion. The Soviets refined the concept by adding variable depth fusing, allowing the weapons to function either on contact, like Hedgehog, or at preset depths like traditional depth charges. The United States Navy continued developing the Hedgehog concept through the Cold War. The Weapon Alpha system, deployed in the 1950s, increased projectile size to improve lethality against larger Soviet submarines. The Mark 108 Weapon Alpha could penetrate the pressure hulls of Soviet Whiskey and Foxtrot-class submarines with single hits, continuing Hedgehog's legacy of contact-fused precision weapons. Modern anti-submarine warfare has largely moved beyond unguided projectiles to guided torpedoes and missiles, but the tactical principles established by Hedgehog remain relevant. The emphasis on maintaining sensor contact throughout the engagement, the use of weapons that minimize false kill assessments, and the psychological impact of demonstrating accurate tracking capability all derive from lessons learned during Hedgehog operations in World War II. The human stories within this technological history provide perspective on warfare's personal dimensions. Oberleutnant C. Horst Bredow survived U-boat service despite experiencing 4 Hedgehog attacks between March and November 1943. His memoir, published in 1978, described the lasting psychological impact. 50 years later, I still have nightmares about those sounds. The rushing noise of projectiles entering water. The silence afterward, waiting to learn if you would live or die. The shock wave when they hit. I survived, but part of me died in those moments. You cannot experience that and remain unchanged. Werner Henke, whose encounter with Hedgehog aboard U-500 opened this narrative, did not survive the war. After his capture and interrogation, he was transferred to Fort Hunt prisoner of war facility in Virginia. In June 1944, he was shot while allegedly attempting to escape. The circumstances remain disputed, with some accounts suggesting he was executed, after resisting interrogation about new U-boat technology. His death, whether accidental or deliberate, added him to the war's vast accounting of casualties. The crew members who survived Hedgehog attacks and submarine sinkings faced their own challenges. Gunther Hessler, who survived the sinking of U-108 by HMS Vanessa using Hedgehog in August 1944, spent the remainder of the war in British captivity. His post-war testimony described the moment of impact. We heard the projectiles entering the water, perhaps 20 or more. Then silence. In that silence, every man held his breath, knowing that if explosions came, some of us would die. The explosions came, 4 direct hits amidships. The boat broke apart within seconds. I was in the control room when water burst through. I don't remember reaching the surface. When I regained consciousness, I was in the water with 7 other survivors. 39 of our crew were gone. The memorial at Moltenort, near Kiel in Germany, lists the names of 30,000 German submariners who died during the war. Among those names are hundreds killed specifically by Hedgehog attacks, though the memorial makes no distinction between causes of death. Each name represents a life ended, a family grieving, a potential unfulfilled. The technology that killed them was remarkable in its effectiveness, but the human cost was universal. Allied sailors who operated Hedgehog and witnessed its effects carried their own burdens. Commander Peter Gretton, who commanded multiple Hedgehog-equipped escort groups, reflected in his 1956 memoir, "We celebrated successful attacks because they meant merchant ships and our sailors would survive. But we never forgot that each success meant German sailors drowning in the dark. War demands such calculations, but it does not make them easier." The strategic conclusion of the Battle of the Atlantic in May 1943 marked the point where Allied anti-submarine capabilities, including Hedgehog, decisively tipped the balance. Admiral Donitz's withdrawal of U-boats from North Atlantic convoy routes acknowledged that submarines could no longer operate effectively against Allied defences, while ultra-code-breaking, long-range aircraft and escort carriers all contributed to this victory. Hedgehog represented the tactical innovation that most directly addressed the fundamental problem of killing submarines once they were detected. The weapon's effectiveness validated the principle that successful military innovation requires not just new technology, but new operational concepts. Hedgehog succeeded because it solved a specific tactical problem, maintaining sonar contact during attacks that conventional depth charges could not address. The engineering was relatively simple compared to radar or sonar, but the tactical impact was profound because it aligned precisely with operational needs. German naval forces never developed an effective counter to Hedgehog because the weapon exploited fundamental physical principles that could not be circumvented through technology alone. A submarine detected by sonar had to evade somehow, but any evasion revealed its position to the tracking vessel. This asymmetry, where the hunter maintained continuous sensor contact while the hunted could not, proved insurmountable given World War II-era technology. The lesson extended beyond anti-submarine warfare. Military forces that achieve persistent sensor contact while denying similar capability to their opponents gain decisive advantages regardless of other technological factors. This principle, demonstrated by Hedgehog in 1943, remains relevant in modern warfare, where sensor capabilities often determine outcomes more directly than weapon lethality. The preservation of Hedgehog weapons in naval museums serves as physical testament to their historical significance. The Imperial War Museum in London displays a complete Hedgehog launcher and projectiles. The National Museum of the United States Navy in Washington exhibits a Hedgehog Mark DAs recovered from a destroyer escort. These artifacts allow contemporary observers to appreciate the weapon's mechanical simplicity, which belies its tactical sophistication. Veterans of anti-submarine warfare occasionally gather at these museums, elderly men sharing memories of battles fought 7 decades ago. They speak of the tension of waiting for Hedgehog impacts, of the relief when silence indicated a miss, of the grim satisfaction when explosions confirmed hits. These conversations, fewer each year as veterans age and die, preserve human context that no historical document can fully capture. The technical specifications of Hedgehog, once closely guarded military secrets, are now published in unclassified histories and technical manuals. The weapon consisted of 24 spigot mortars arranged in 4 rows of 6, each firing a 65-pound projectile containing 32 pounds of Torpex explosive. Range was 250 yards, pattern diameter 130 feet, time of flight 8 seconds. These dry facts described a weapon system that fundamentally changed naval warfare. The operational employment of Hedgehog required destroyer crews to master new skills. Sonar operators learned to maintain tracking solutions through temperature layers and acoustic shadows. Weapons officers calculated firing solutions that accounted for submarine depth, speed, and course. Ship commanders developed tactical judgment about when to fire, balancing the desire for higher probability shots against the risk that delays would allow submarines to escape. Training programs for Hedgehog operations emphasized the weapon's unique characteristics. Unlike depth charges, where explosions confirmed you had attacked even if you missed, Hedgehog's silence after misses required crews to maintain psychological resilience. The absence of explosions could mean either that the submarine had evaded successfully or that your firing solution was inaccurate. Only subsequent sonar contact could resolve the uncertainty. The evolution of anti-submarine tactics around Hedgehog demonstrated how new weapons drive doctrinal innovation. Early doctrine treated Hedgehog as a replacement for depth charges to be employed in similar circumstances. Experience revealed that Hedgehog worked best when approached as an entirely different weapon system requiring dedicated tactics. This lesson, learned through combat experience, influenced weapons development programs for decades afterward. Admiral Sir Max Houghton, Commander-in-Chief Western Approaches from November 1942 until war's end, recognized Hedgehog's strategic significance. His directive of March 1943 prioritized equipping all escort vessels with Hedgehog and training crews in its employment. This institutional commitment, backed by industrial production and doctrinal development, transformed a promising prototype into a war-winning weapon system. The production statistics reveal Allied industrial commitment. British and American shipyards manufactured over 1,000 Hedgehog launchers between 1942 and 1945. Ammunition production exceeded 200,000 projectiles. This industrial effort, diverting resources from other weapons programs, demonstrated leadership confidence in Hedgehog's potential impact. The weapon's effectiveness justified this investment. Cost-benefit analysis conducted by Allied operational research teams calculated that each Hedgehog-equipped destroyer sank an average of 0.8 submarines during the war. Traditional depth-charge attacks achieved 0.3 submarines per destroyer. The nearly threefold improvement in effectiveness validated the resources devoted to Hedgehog production and deployment. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.